Part 1.
"Get down!" Train heard the shout just in time. He barely had time to duck behind the rusty stump of a broken garbage collector before a whistle blew over his head. A plasma capsule struck the wall behind him, leaving a large charred hole in the intricate but unreadable logo of some teenage gang. Grunting, Train pulled out his discharger, though he hadn't quite figured out who was shooting at him or from where. Before he took a chance and peeked out from behind his cover, he looked around and saw a figure in a familiar black and yellow jumpsuit a few meters away. The man was lying behind some crumpled, rusty container, inserting a new clip into a large discharger. "Klaus?" The man raised his head and bared his large yellowish teeth in a grin. Then he lifted his arm with the discharger out from behind his hiding place and fired a long burst in the direction of the mysterious gunman. It was illegal to convert handheld dischargers to full auto, but Klaus had never really cared. "Damn right, it's me. What are you doing here?" Train blinked several times. The acrid stench of burning old plastic made his eyes water. Some murky guy was offering 200 power cells for the raiders, like from decommissioned Navy surplus for next to nothing. They can be modified to fit our tugboats, so I came to take a look. "Alshin?" Thrain looked at Klaus in puzzlement. Some scraps and wisps were stuck in his thick, graying beard, making Klaus look like a drunken Santa. "Yeah, how do you know? He contacted me this morning." Klaus grinned again. "He called me too. Only he didn't offer me energy cells. He offered me 3 cases of handgun magazines. Guess where from?" "Navy surplus, I suppose." "You got it." Klaus rolled onto his stomach. "Hey, I think it's getting quiet. We can't just lie here forever." Before Train could answer, Klaus jumped up to his full height and pointed the discharger deep into the junk-filled old dock. Train, cursing, jumped up next, ready to duck back in anticipation of more shots. It was quiet, however. Klaus was already walking confidently with his heavy, sprawling gait toward the far exit of the dock. The floor was strewn with random junk, crunching under the massive soles of his army-style boots. It took them about 3 minutes to get there. "Something tells me that there wasn't any leftover merchandise here to begin with," Klaus said. "Neither was Alshin himself," Train added. The burst Klaus fired pierced the armor and hit the energy core. The detonated power unit had torn the turret apart, turning it into a twisted flower of melted electronics and sharp shards of armor, but there was no doubt. It was a portable turret with twin automatic dischargers. Whoever had installed it probably didn't know how to set it up, or maybe the aiming unit was malfunctioning. Otherwise, Klaus and Train wouldn't stand a chance. Before Klaus's lucky hit, the turret had clearly been operating in single-fire mode and at half-charge power. Trainy's stomach sucked unpleasantly as he imagined what would have happened if the turret had engaged them in maximum combat mode. "Looks like you really pissed off somebody," Klaus said, holstering his discharger. Train shrugged. "Or maybe you did." But the targets were probably not Klaus Nalfer and Train Backwater, but members of the Ring. Klaus kicked the battered turret. "You're right. That's why we should probably get quickly out of here. Besides, even if whoever set up the turret doesn't come back with his friends to check on the outcome of the ambush, Chief Kashida's cops will be swarming around here soon enough. No need to annoy them." He was about to turn around, but suddenly he squinted and leaned toward the turret. "Wait a minute. What the hell is that? Shit, it can't be. What did you find in there?" Train also took a step closer to the destroyed gun. The cyber brain of an insidious intruder from a higher evil dimension? Klaus loved the old sci-fi comic books full of ridiculous characters. "I wish it's that," Klaus said, gingerly wiping some detail in the depths of the broken turret. "This would have been a much better option, believe me. Looks like you and I are in some pretty serious shit." Maybe the whole station is in some serious shit. And he pointed to his find. It was a pivoting console on which the twin dischargers were mounted. The dischargers had melted, losing their original shape, but the console had survived. Klaus wiped the soot off the console's surface, but it remained in the recesses of the metal-stamped inscription, making it even more eye-striking. Spiky, unfamiliar letters that looked like the ancient cuneiform script that Train remembered from his high school history book. The Ullerian alphabet. "I'll be damned," Train said, confused. "How did this come here?" Klaus scrutinized the wreckage. "There's more." He pointed to several other parts that still bore traces of Ullerian factory markings. "This isn't just some homemade piece of hardware made from whatever came to hand, though you don't stumble randomly upon Ullerian spare parts these days. Looks like this turret came out of some Ullerian military factory." He tapped his finger on the lettering on the console and the back of the surviving armor plate. The serial numbers match. "I didn't know you read Ullerian," Train remarked. "I didn't know it myself," Klaus said. "I'd hoped that in the 30 years since the war ended, I'd forgotten about that bloody thing. Turns out I hadn't. If someone is plotting to bring toys like this to the station, it's bad for two reasons," Train said. "First, it's a serious player. You don't just buy Ullerian weapons at the first rummage sale. You need a lot of really deep connections. Secondly, this serious player has either declared war on the ring himself or is supplying somebody who did it, and we have no idea what's going on. We're a few moves behind the game." The floor beneath their feet shuddered. "Crap." Train looked around worriedly. It looked like the skimmer with Kishida's men had docked. "They'll be here in a few minutes. We've got to get out of here, or there's going to be a lot of explaining to do. Besides, you're on parole with a big automatic discharger on your side." "What are we going to do with this?" Klaus nodded at the turret. "Kishida's smart, and he's experienced. He's not going to let it go." Train shrugged. "We'll have to leave it as it is. We won't be able to get it out of here in time anyway. The main thing now is not to get caught, and we'll deal with Kishida's questions later. After all, it wasn't us who put this turret here. So let him look for the culprit. Maybe we even get some info out from his efforts." They turned and ran to the dock's exit, to the small outer airlocks where they left their skimmers. As the airlock doors closed behind them, heavy footsteps rumbled at the far end of the dock, and the first cops appeared at the broken turret.
Part 2.
"What the hell were you two doing there in the first place? How long has it been since you've been stabbed by some teen morons?" Train and Klaus looked at each other. It was not in the spirit of Delmain Backwater to play the caring daddy, even though he was indeed Train's father. Of course, none of the ring members had any reason to frequent the Rot Gut, as the few outer sectors of the station where Train and Klaus had been ambushed were called. Unlike the rest of the station, the Rot Gut had virtually no intelligible governance, either official or criminal. Even by the station standards, Rot Gut was an ugly slum, with a few teenage gangs fighting for power without much success. Chief Kishida, oddly enough, was okay with this. He recruited the fresh meat from the gangs he had caught, and from time to time, usually before an election, he organized noisy raids with a pompous announcement of the results of the cleanup. But then new gangs took their place, and the wheel of anti-karma kept turning. As for the rest of the station's inhabitants, they simply couldn't care less about the Rot Gut. "Look, Del, you know as well as we do that things aren't going well," Klaus said judiciously. "After the feds intercepted that transport from New Hope, we still can't recover our losses. Train and I had tips on good deals, so we thought we'd see if we could fish out anything." "Good deals in Rot Gut? A batch of homemade knives and kitchen-brewed poison dope? The ring doesn't do that kind of shit." "Chill out," Train said. Yeah, we may have been a little stupid on that, but at least we're looking for a way out. We've dealt with this Alchin before on small stuff, and there's never been a problem. If anyone knew he was messing with serious players, the rumors would have reached us by now. Everyone's alive, everyone's in place, and since the shit already hit the fan, we shouldn't blame each other, but start finding out what it really was and who was behind it. Delmain was silent for a few seconds, breathing heavily, then gave up and sank into his chair. Shank and Kylina were attacked today too, he said, looking at the wall of old stereo images to the left of his desk. They were supposed to meet with Quan representatives at Dock 8 about shipments through the Celestial Temple. They're fine, he said ahead of Klaus, who had already opened his mouth. Kylina's arm is a little snagged, but it's nothing serious. A couple days in the Regan sleeve, and she'll be fine. She and Shank whisked off to his place, taking a few days off to get well. Another turret? Train asked. They don't know. It was a nasty spot. They couldn't get a good look at anything or fight back, so they preferred to get the hell out of there, especially since Kylina was out of condition. I told you couldn't trust Quan, Klaus grumbled, slumping back in his chair. His red-haired hands clenched into massive fists. Traitors once, traitors forever. Train pulled up a chair and sat at the other side of Delmain, across from Klaus. The war ended 30 years ago, Klaus, he said. And Quan was only about 5 years old then. They're all the same, father and son. Klaus slammed his fist on the table. Ullerian spawn. I don't give a damn whose spawn they are, Delmain said. Quan had nothing to do with it. How can you be so sure? Train asked. Because Quan's men never made it out of the 8th dock. All 3 of them were mowed down by the first burst. Delmain sighed. And now we'll have to explain to Quan that we had nothing to do with it. He looked at Klaus. And given your history with the Celestial Temple, that won't be easy. If it were up to me, I'd put 3 or 4 antimatter torpedoes into their stinking station, Klaus said. But I'd do it honestly, without all the dirty sneaking around. You know me. I do. But Quans would want more than have me personally vouch for you. So the 2 of you are gonna find out who might be behind this right away. Are you sure the 2 attacks are connected? Train asked. Are you saying that we've got 2 crazies on the station who have balls of iron enough to take on the ring? Delmain answered the question with a question. And with access to weapons no one's seen in 15 years, Klaus said. I agree with Del. But why don't we leave the search to our precious Chief Kishida? After all, it's his job. Let him do something useful instead of stepping on our toes and spitting in our drinks. Before Del could respond, the green light on the comm panel in front of him flashed. Del looked at the screen of the device. You can ask him that question in person, he said. Kishida would be here in a moment. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. And you'd better quickly come up with some decent lies to tell him about your reasons for coming to the Rot Gut. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, Station D13 was a large commercial and industrial complex, a hub of intersystem business that covered at least a few dozen inhabited worlds, and not only human ones. Then, the war with the Ullerians began, and interstellar trade came to an end. The station was lucky. It was on the opposite edge of the populated sector of the galaxy from the front line, and the fighting never reached it. But the refugees did. Already in the final stage of the war, when it became clear that the Federation was about to crush the Ullerians, the aliens undertook a desperate suicide raid on the rear of the Earth's sphere of influence. No longer attempting to occupy and exploit inhabited planets, they destroyed everything they could. Due to the peculiarities of psychology, the Ullerians concentrated their strikes exclusively on planets. And when the real panic in the colonies began, Streams of refugees poured into the station scattered in various corners of the developed sector of the galaxy. Station D13 has not had the best of days. For various reasons, the military did not requisition its industrial facilities for military purposes, and the cut-off supply lines and lack of orders practically finished off all the industrial enterprises located there. Trade died with them, and the station had a rather miserable existence, gradually becoming a ghostly semblance of itself. The first wave of refugees at the station was even welcomed, hoping that the influx of population would somehow revitalize the fading life of the huge complex. But the first was followed by a second, third, fourth, and fifth as the Ullerians fought their way to new colonies. Eventually, the Federation fleet caught up with the remnants of the Ullerian raiders and completely destroyed them. But by then, the station's population had increased nearly 200-fold. The station teetered on the brink of sliding into nightmarish chaos. Food supplies had been cut off since the war began, and the hydroponic farms had barely enough capacity to meet the natives' needs. New facilities had to be built urgently, but there was no more talk of hydroponic gardens of any kind. There were endless vats of chlorella and primitive but efficient plants that processed the chlorella into tasteless rations. The remaining Federation officials tried to maintain at least a semblance of order, but their power did not extend beyond the most privileged areas of the station. Refugees and marooned locals began to self-organize to protect themselves from the rapidly flourishing crime. This usually took place around the offices of large companies, many of which were still inhabited by former employees of those companies, and some of which still had decent arsenals. One such office was the headquarters of Backwater Enterprises, a small spacecraft and orbital repair and maintenance company owned by the Backwater family. Although left virtually bankrupt, the Backwaters did not flee the station that had long been their home. By negotiating, and sometimes by violent clashes with various factions, they gradually brought relative order to the station and became its practical rulers. Then, the war ended, and the Federation returned. Some refugees went home, but most stayed behind, as many had nowhere to go after the Ullerian raid. The Federation, shriveled by the war, did not favorably regard the self-appointed local rulers. Under pressure from the military and police, the Backwaters were forced to fade into the shadows, gradually becoming like those they had once fought against. However, the station's population had forgotten nothing, and not only the Backwaters, but also the station's governors and police chiefs had to find a new balance. The official name D13 remained only in the official Federation registry. Everyone else now knew the station as Backwater Station. That included the station's longtime chief of police, Hideki Kishida, who was now entering the main office of Backwater Enterprises, where Delmain, Train, and Klaus were waiting for him.
Part 3.
One of Hideki Kishida's most noticeable traits was that reading anything on his face was almost impossible. His steely equanimity remained intact under nearly any circumstance, including a sudden ambush by smugglers. Now, however, he had raised his voice noticeably, which to those who knew him well indicated that the police chief was out of control. Few people on the station knew Kishida as well as Delmain Backwater did. "Look, Del, there's a limit to everything," Kishida said, looking straight into the older Backwater's eyes. "Just because you're the direct heir to the station's self-appointed savior doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want here. The wild days of war are long gone, and you'd better back off a bit, damn it, or I'll take you seriously." Delmain slammed his fist on the table. "What the hell, Hideki? You come here to me and accuse me of what? That my men were attacked? Including my son, by the way. Are you out of your damn mind?" Kishida stepped toward the table, and Delmain jumped to meet him. Train, who was standing a little to the side, stepped forward, ready to break them up. However, Kishida and Delmain held back. Two old, hardened wolves. They knew when to fight and when to keep their emotions down, no matter how much anger was stirring in their hearts. "I know that almost nothing happens on the station without your knowledge," Kishida said in a slightly lower tone. Train decided that was a good sign and relaxed a little. "Your sign about the repair and logistics business can only fool idiots. Backwaters have always been and will always remain the power on the station, and if that power starts a war for territories, it won't just be bad for them and their opponents, but for the whole station." Del exhaled slowly, and Train realized that his father had dealt with the outburst of anger and was already thinking of ways to turn the situation to his advantage. It was like a chess game between two grandmasters who had each made a rash move and were now considering whether the moves had damaged their position on the board. "Hideki, you think I don't realize that?" Delmain said. "Things have been bad enough for us lately without it. Besides, you know as well as I do that we've always tried to keep order on this station, not start bloodbaths. I swear, I have no idea who's behind these two attacks. You probably know more than we do by now." It was an unmistakable hint, and of course, Kishida understood it. The police chief sighed heavily, waved his hand, and pulled up a chair. Everyone sat back down at the table. "I'm sorry, Del. I guess I did overreact a little," Kishida said. "You see, I really do know a lot more than you. All of you." He covered his eyes and was silent for a few seconds, gathering his thoughts. There were not 2 attacks, but 3. Train quickly glanced at his father and shook his head. They had already checked on all the other ring members currently on the station. Everyone was fine. No one had had any bad incidents except for a tiff with a squabbling neighbor. Of course, everyone was now alert and on their guard. No one would go into dodgy hoods alone without checking with the ring. "Don't bother," Kishida said, though it was as if he wasn't even looking at the silent conversation between the backwaters. "You have nothing to do with the 3rd case. At least, I hope not. 2 of my men were ambushed when they arrived on a call about an abandoned ship in Dock 11, Tolman and Chatwega. They're both alive, but Chatwega's got serious burns. Some old garbage went up in flames. It's been a long time since I've had a crack at those smugglers. They've been cluttering up the docks." No one answered, but Train knew precisely what was on everyone's mind. A planned attack on the police was a serious thing, and such incidents always had dire consequences. Sure, every now and then, some junkie in the rot gut or some drunken smuggler would try to poke a cop with something sharp, but that was different. "Another Ullerian army turret?" Train asked, breaking the heavy silence. "Yes." Kishida looked at him carefully. Train shrugged his shoulders. "We got a close look at few things before the cavalry arrived," he said. "You always have time for closer looks," Kishida grumbled unhappily. "But this time, it's for the best. If you really don't know where this bad wind is coming from, and I'm now inclined to believe that you don't, then, as much as I hate it, we'll have to act together. At any rate, at least coordinate our efforts to some extent." Delmain thoughtfully fiddled with a trinket he'd taken from the shelf beside his chair. It was a miniature model of the station as it had been in its heyday, clean, neat, with no ugly sprouts of self-building here and there. "To be honest, I thought we could do it ourselves," he said. "I thought it was our internal matter, and there was no need to involve the official authorities. But now I think I agree with you, but with reservations." Kishida grinned. "I'm not going to demand that you immediately show me all your black accounting and all your schemes for illegal shipments of whatever you're hauling in and out of the station all the time. I mean, I certainly wouldn't mind slamming shut your shop once and for all. But not at that cost. I have a feeling that whoever is behind these attacks wants to rock the boat as hard as possible so that everyone will drop overboard. What's the point? Klaus spoke up for the first time. Until then, he had been sitting there, picking grimly at his fingernails with a small pocket knife. Ullerian heavy weaponry is some serious shit. If word of it gets out to the wrong ears, the station will be in the crosshairs of the military and counterintelligence. They don't work the way we do. Half the station will go to prison and forced labor in the colonies. The rest will be squared up and made to walk the line. By the way, isn't that what you've been trying to do for God knows how many years? Kishida shook his head. Not at all. You've got it right. But there's no place for me in this military utopia either. I'll go to some dung and hay-smelling planet to catch cattle thieves and exhort drunks. But most importantly, the military never goes anywhere permanently. They'll come to the station, do a total cleanup, and then they'll get bored and leave it to its fate. All so neat and shiny. And ready for consumption. Delmain nodded. For whoever organized the attacks, or even for whoever was pulling the organizers' strings, looks like these guys, whoever they are playing for keeps. Then we have a deal? Kishida stood up and extended his hand to Delmain. He also stood up and shook the police chief's hand. I guess so. If there are any further questions, we'll deal with them on the go, and we'll keep each other informed. I need to take a closer look at what's left of the turrets, Klaus said. I take it you've got all three already? Kishida grimaced like from a toothache. That's evidence in an official investigation. How am I supposed to let thugs from the most... Okay. He waved his hand toward the menacingly grinning Klaus. Come to think of it, if anyone on this piece of metal knows anything about Ullerian weaponry, it's you. I'll see what I can do. Do you have any ideas yet? I do. As a thug with a lot of experience with Ullerian heavy weapons, Kishida grimaced again, I noticed that the turrets weren't set up very well. Simply put, whoever had installed them did a really shitty job, like a complete and utter noob. If a professional had done it, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. You'd be looking at my charred ass in the morgue. Kishida froze in place. Damn, I hadn't thought of that. What's in it for us? Maybe whoever's behind this got their hands on this weapon completely by accident and couldn't find enough experienced people willing to work for them, Train said, and didn't risk hiring veterans for fear they'd turn him to military predators. Or waste him themselves, Klaus added happily. Or he's a veteran who hired a noob for a diversion, Delmain said. Let's not go to our favorite tarot deck. We need to look for solid information. I'll contact my people, Klaus said. Maybe someone heard something. Kishida looked at him intently. Which people do you consider as yours? He asked casually. All of them, Klaus said, smirking. And I do mean all of them, on both sides. Kishida just shook his head, waved goodbye to Delmain, and walked out. I didn't know you had ties to the Ullerian veterans, Train said. I thought you hated Ullerians. Klaus patted Train on the shoulder. Boy, if life were so simple, we wouldn't be puzzling over who has tried to fry us, because I would be dead for a long time by now. Train, you'll have to fly to the Celestial Temple, Delmain said. I can't leave the station right now, and Quan won't listen to anyone else. Just take someone with you, anyone but this freak. He nodded at Klaus. I don't want to go there anyway, Klaus shrugged. Too much stench for me in there. I'll check in with Shank and Kailina, Train said. It's a few days' flight to the Celestial Temple, and Kailina's arm will heal as nicely on the way as at home. The floor beneath their feet shuddered, and the framed pictures on the wall swayed, supported by the clinking of glasses and bottles at the bar. A moment later, the air rattled with a muffled, resounding boom. What the hell? Klaus said, puzzled. At that moment, the door to the office swung open, and one of the workers from the workshop that serviced the station's skimmers stormed into the room. He looked completely insane. Take it easy, Tarky, Delmain said. Did you see a ghost? What happened out there? Someone speed crushed into the repair dock? Tarky, a tall, skinny guy barely in his 20s, took a breath and stared at the older Backwater. Chief Kishida just got blown up, he said.
Part 4.
I don't like this, Train said. Why isn't there a single ship here? Why is there only an automatic beacon transmitting? Something's not right. Maybe the old man's just drunk and sleeping off his ass under his desk, Kylena suggested. With her hand tucked into a bulky container of biogel, she looked like some cyborg villain from a cheap holo show. The obscene pictures with lewd captions that she and Shank had decorated the surface of the case spoiled the impression. That doesn't feel like him, Shank said. I knew Chung before he settled here on the Celestial Temple and started working for Quan. He's not a saint, but he's always been very discreet about booze, and he's stopped drinking anything stronger than beer as he's gotten older. Besides, he didn't work here alone, Train said. The last time I was here, Chung had several assistants. Couldn't all 4 of them have gone on a bender at once? And what about all the repair and refill crew down here? Besides, this is the main dock of the Celestial Temple. Where are all the ships? They looked at the control tower of the main pier of the Celestial Temple station, which, like the entire dock, did not show the slightest sign of life. It was usually quite crowded. Celestial Temple, a relatively small orbital station, dozens of times smaller than Backwater Station, was built in orbit around the main planet of the Great Dragon System, where several busy trade routes converged. During the war, the Ullerians did not destroy the station, nor did they convert its population into automaton slaves by reprogramming their minds. It's hard to say why, but the fleet commander who took over the station gave its population a choice. Either they cooperate with the Ullerians, or they'll all be thrown out the airlock. By Ullerian standards, this was a genuinely unheard-of display of humanity. Giving a choice, even one so obvious, to an inferior species was completely out of character for the Ulleri conglomerate. The result might have been more drastic if this were a military base with a staff of sworn soldiers and officers. However, the station was inhabited by ordinary people with their families, wives, children, and old people. So, the station made a decision that forever tarnished the inhabitants as traitors for some, like war veteran Klaus. We should look around since we're here anyway, Train said. Shank looked at him, smirking with the corner of his mouth. Are you sure? It looks kind of creepy. He nodded toward the deserted docking platform. Maybe they're just waiting for us to get out so they can chop us up into a fine salad. I'm sure word has already gotten back to Quan about what happened to his men on Backwater. Then why don't they just put a few torpedoes into the ship on approach? Kylena has joined the conversation. Their defenses are fine. She pointed to several gun turrets and launchers visible some distance from the landing platform. Quan had always been obsessed with security, and if he decided to finish us off in retaliation for his men, he wouldn't be hatching such an elaborate scheme. I'm going to agree with Train. If this isn't Old Man Chung and his buddies partying large, then something strange has happened, or is happening. Shank stood up and walked over to the armory. Well, whatever. If you want to look around, let's go then. But I'm not going in there naked. There's something fishy going on, mark my words. And he opened the door of his battlesuit compartment with a decisive gesture. For several reasons, one of which was the frequent attempts by patriotic citizens of the Federation to wreak havoc on the station. Purely out of noble motives, of course, but the main one was the desire to loot those who had survived the war relatively well. There was no direct access to the station. All those arriving at the Celestial Temple docked at a separate module connected to the station by a kilometer-long transport tunnel, through which the shuttle on a magnetic cushion ran. It was unclear how the Quan family managed to pull it off, but the Celestial Temple, even after the war and the departure of the Ullerians, remained a formally independent station, and therefore had the right to its own means of defense. There were rumors that the station was being used by high-ranking Federation officials to cover whatever black schemes they were willing to run, but no one knew for sure. Anyway, it quickly became clear that the Celestial Temple was not to be trifled with. Long before the Feds had wiped out the post-war Freedom Festival, which, to be fair, should have been called banal piracy, the dashing privateer captains had realized that the Celestial Temple was out of their league. The traces of those past times were still visible in some places on the platform structures. Patches of re-welded armor plates on the gun turrets, remnants of the old control room that had been torn apart by a direct hit from a privateer torpedo, and other such signs would immediately catch the eye of an experienced observer. However, all these were echoes of the distant past. The bad times of the wild post-war frontier had long since passed. At least that's how it seemed a week ago. Quiet as the grave, Shank's voice came through the headphones. He stood at the far entrance to the service hangars for the maintenance skimmers and peered inside through the half-open gate. Skimmers in place, but not a living soul. Same story. Train walked along the pier ramp, cautiously peering through every door he came across. Coming up to the control room, let's see what's in there. He pulled a plasma discharger from his belt holster and checked the charge meter. So far, everything has been quiet, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Space is clear, Kaylena reported. She couldn't wear a combat suit because of the regeneration sleeve, and in any case, someone had to stay on the ship and keep an eye on the general situation. And on the air too, by the way. Okay, let's say there's no one on the docking platform, but the station is full of people. Why the hell are they keeping radio silence? Afraid, maybe? Shank said. He too drew his weapon, a large military-style pulse gun, and stepped inside the hangar. Say, they saw some wicked shit and decided to shut up lest something bad happen. Though that doesn't sound like Quan at all, to be honest. The lights work here, by the way, he said, and the dark opening of the hangar door lit up with a steady white light. Be careful out there, Train said. We don't want to run into another couple of turrets. He glanced at the screen of the armband scanner. Though the readings seemed to be clean, no additional power sources other than the ones that were supposed to be on the station. He noticed a bright green dot moving slowly down the corridor from the hangars to the maintenance office and grinned. And our spacesuits, of course. Be careful you don't mistake me for a bomb and shoot me. Don't worry, I'm not that dumb. Shank mumbled something unintelligible. This is weird. Looks like people rushed out in a hurry. Chairs overturned, mugs knocked over. But no traces of a firefight so far. Like everybody just jumped and ran the hell away. Train walked cautiously up the stairs of the control tower. On the first level, he pressed the elevator button several times, but although the elevator's serviceability indicator glowed a fair green light, the elevator never arrived. Someone must have propped the doors open with something. Okay, that's even better. Otherwise you'd get there, the doors sliding open, and there'd be an ambush. It doesn't even have to be a Ullerian battle turret. Just a couple of thugs with heavy emitters will do. Guys, I've spotted something, Kaylena said in a worried voice, and I don't like it. We didn't notice it right away, but there are fresh holes from gunshots on one of the far domes. I'm heading that way, Shank replied. You're saying they were shot from a distance? That's the thing, no, Kaylena said. I just adjusted the optics. Judging by the holes, the dome was shot from the inside. It's like there was some kind of desperate firefight. Be careful, Shank, she said with obvious concern. We don't know what happened in there. Train climbed the penultimate step and peered cautiously around the corner of the elevator shaft into the spacious main control room, weapon at the ready. A moment later, he was holstering the discharger and stepping calmly into the room. "Now we know," he said with a sigh. "Shonk, you'd better not break in there at full speed, though probably nobody will meet you there. Nobody alive, anyway." Surprisingly, all the automation of the control panel worked as if nothing had happened. The indicators of the various tracking sensors were blinking, and the large circular eyes of the long-range detection scanners were flickering with a ghostly greenish light. One would have thought that nothing much had happened. The only thing that spoiled the picture were the bodies of the senior dispatcher and the permanent duty officer of the dock platform of the Celestial Temple, Chung, and his 4 assistants lying on the floor wherever they had been shot, at their chairs, at the console, and even at the large automatic coffee machine. One body lay in the elevator doorway. Each had charred holes in their chest or head from pulse rifle shots. Train took a quick look at the dead. It looked like they had been taken by surprise and shot on the spot. A professional job, 1 shot each. Someone had come up the stairs here, shot the 4 people in the control room, waited for another one coming up the elevator, hit him too, and quietly walked away, leaving everyone lying where they fell. It was obvious that this was not a robbery. The bodies had clearly not been touched. "Holy shit," came Shonk's voice. "It's a real bloodbath in here. It looks like the entire staff was herded in here and then shot at point-blank range with pulse guns. It's hard to tell exactly. You can't tell one body from another. What the hell have we gotten ourselves into?" Train suddenly noticed that several indicators on the console were blinking, which didn't seem to be on when he entered the control room. He took a closer look. Crap. He turned and dashed for the control room exit, then stomped down the stairs. "Shonk, get out of there now. Get to the ship now. Kylena, get ready to pull out of here as soon as we jump in." They didn't make it. The magnetic shuttle's reception platform was only a dozen meters from the pad where Kylena had landed their ship, and the control room and hangar entrances were 100 meters away. Train and Shonk had only managed to run half that distance when the doors of the arriving shuttle opened and armed men in assault armor poured out. They immediately took up firing positions and took aim at Train, Shonk, and the ship. Train and Shonk looked at each other and stopped, not even trying to reach for their weapons. 2 against 40 is a noisy and unkempt way to commit suicide. "If I were the pilot, I wouldn't even touch the throttles," a familiar voice said in the earphones. "That's Kylena, isn't it? I've got a few launchers here, and they'll put holes in you in no time." From behind the taller fighters, who looked even more imposing because of their bulky armor, came a medium-sized man in an ordinary civilian light suit. The only thing that distinguished him from some ordinary technician was the glittering inlay on his helmet, an image of a dragon, stylized like ancient Chinese pictures. "I was expecting my old buddy Klaus to show up with a gang of his righteous, bloodthirsty veteran friends," said K-Kwan Jr., the de facto owner of the Celestial Temple Station. "But I see you instead. Did old rat Backwater get so fed up with his son that he decided to send him on a deliberately suicidal mission?" Shonk slowly raised his hands and looked at the train. "I told you it was a bad idea," he said.
Part 5.
Not all stations, or even the planets of the post-war Federation, especially those that weren't of much interest to the military or the federal government, could maintain order, even as relative as the Backwater Station. But when you went outside the Federation, into the motley kaleidoscope of free settlements that, even before the war, had not been a very safe place for the casual tourist, you definitely had to keep your eyes open. Klaus, however, was anything but a casual tourist. For this journey, he'd taken from Backwater a ship that had been supposedly non-existent for a dozen years, first demilitarized, that is, stripped of all weapons, and then decommissioned and sent for recycling at the New Hope shipyards. None of this was true, and if Klaus had been intercepted by a military patrol, it would have been tough for him to explain what he was doing on a fully armed, even with modified torpedoes and mass driver guns, Manticore Raider 30 years after the end of hostilities. However, military patrols were rarely, if ever, seen in the places Klaus was headed. There was still the possibility of encountering another, far more dangerous force. A small one, of course, but it couldn't be dismissed out of hand. Self-guided minefields and automatic interceptor stations, even decades old, could not be discounted. When the moderate faction in the Ullerian conglomerate finally came to power and decided to put an end to the war with the Earth Federation, which the conglomerate was already hopelessly losing, some star systems were already so mangled and devastated by the war that neither the humans, nor their allies, nor the completely exsanguinated conglomerate wanted to clean them up and rebuild them. It was here that those for whom unnecessary attention could be dangerous could hide from such attention. It meant attention from both the victorious and defeated sides of the war. The problem was that the hidden ones weren't exactly welcoming uninvited guests, and they didn't issue invitations to anyone. Of course, Klaus had sent an encrypted hypergram to an unregistered relay station in the Chang'at system, but it was not certain it had reached its destination. It could have fallen into the hands of other humans, or non-humans. However, against his expectations and fears, Klaus reached his destination almost without incident, except for a half-hour game of catch-up with a missile mine. He finally managed to blast it away with a mass driver, and a forced flight through the atmosphere of a gas giant, the sixth planet in the system, to avoid detection by the suspiciously intact automated orbital fort, which was not in any of the old military or new clandestine logs. He managed to make it through the rest without further obstacles. 3 more hours later, he was already mooring his raider at the docking ramp of Kandazog Station. The word Kandazog in Ullerian meant greatness, but the irony was that this greatness, strictly speaking, had very little to do with the conglomerate. The hop-up station for mid-range raiders had once been built by humans, but along with the system, it had been captured early in the war and customized by the Ullerians to suit their needs. The sector where the Chang'at system was located was devastated by the war. Some of the planets had been nuked, and eventually, those who had survived the occupation and the fighting had fled, leaving the system a graveyard of broken space equipment that was still partially functional and quite dangerous, as Klaus had recently experienced. When the grayish-white hull of the station obscured all visible space and the familiar thud of the mooring clamps, accompanied by a distinctive shuddering sound, swept across the raider, a strange feeling came over Klaus. Several years of war, then another 3 decades of continuous travel across the entire human sector of the galaxy, plus occasional trips outside of it. He had long ago gotten used to considering himself a civilian, with a few adjustments maybe, used to calling Backwater his home. But this feeling would probably stay with him forever. Back at the war, he experienced it every time he returned to base from another combat sortie. More often than not, he was missing one of his comrades who had gone on the mission with him. Judging by the other ramps being empty, he was the first to arrive. Well, that was even for the better. It would give him time to check everything and prepare for any unforeseen circumstances, especially considering that here on Greatness, almost all circumstances are usually unforeseen. The transitional airlock, the empty armory, and the general gallery that led to the station's central rooms looked like they hadn't been used in years. Perhaps that was actually the case. Klaus himself had last traveled to the station. When had that been? That's right, 8 years ago. That's when he met here with... The floor beneath Klaus's feet shook slightly. It wasn't much. An ordinary civilian in his place probably wouldn't have even noticed it. But to Klaus, it was a sure signal. Another ship had arrived at the station. The comms were silent, however. As he left, he adjusted his radar's communications node to broadcast all signals to the receiver of the combat suit. The person he planned to meet at the station would be sure to notify Klaus of their arrival. It was about a 5-minute walk to the station's central console. Klaus pulled a heavy emitter from his holster and lowered the armored face shield of his helmet. He would find out soon enough. At that moment, the station shook, sending him tumbling down the corridor, hitting the wall and rolling behind the curve of a long metal gut, and just in time. Several plasma discharges struck the wall where he just stood. Groaning, Klaus rose to his feet and sprinted away. He wasn't going to get into a firefight with an unknown enemy, at least not until he found some cover. At this marvelous thought, Klaus burst into the central post, which once controlled the entire life of the station. The basic functionality of the greatness station, along with any remnants of the greatness as a virtue, of course, had long ago been lost. But some things still worked, as long as the 2 auxiliary small quark reactors were functioning. The berthing automatics, for example. The console, of course, had been remodeled for the Ullerian personnel, and Klaus, cursing desperately, tried to read the half-forgotten, vaguely familiar symbols over the instruments and control keys. His pursuers didn't seem to be following him yet. Apparently, they were not too attracted to the idea of running headlong into the very likely oncoming fire. They would soon realize that they could simply split up and enter the post from several sides at once. Damn it, where the hell is that bulkhead control terminal? Okay. This one looks like it's connected to the airlocks, the personnel quarters, and this one, that's the row to the right. You're looking at restrooms, storerooms, and other technical areas. Klaus turned around swiftly, raising his weapon. A tall figure of characteristic angular outlines, dressed in a light spacesuit and unarmed, stood literally 2 steps away from him. Klaus lowered the gun. Damn you, Dabzon! You can't sneak up on old people like that. Their nerves are weak. I almost put holes in you. Instead of answering, the Ullerian stepped past Klaus and pressed a few keys on the right row. 3 of the 5 doors leading to the central station slammed shut. I'm not too happy to see you either, the Ullerian said. But let's get as far away from here as possible without casualties before we continue to express our mutual dislike, shall we? Klaus only shook his head. For a Ullerian, Dabzon Shinbar had an incredible sense of humor, or rather, sarcasm. All that remains is to somehow make it to the ships, he said to the Ullerian. In case you haven't noticed, there's some very unfriendly company between the dock and us. Who are they, by the way? Warriors of the true path, Dabzon said, not taking his eyes off the console. After pressing a few more keys, he straightened up. By the way, you don't have to worry about getting into your raider. They blew it to shreds along with a good chunk of the dock. Blimey, Klaus said confusedly, addressing that expression to both pieces of news at once. The true path is still alive? I thought they were all done. And how will we get out of here if our ships are vaporized? Well, as you can see, not all of them, Dabzon answered. And as for the ship, only yours was vaporized. Mine is hidden where it can't be found easily. Klaus thought there was a slight sneer in the alien's gaze mixed with sympathy. But who would really know those damn Ullerians? After all, I served on this station, and I know a thing or two about it, the Ullerian finished. So are we going? I've sealed off everything I can, but it won't keep them out long. I'd prefer to postpone the encounter with the true ones until we have numerical superiority on our side. Klaus shook his head. Yes. Let's move. I'm not planning to exchange greetings with these guys either. Especially since they have already paid their respects, he added, rubbing his bruised shoulder. As Dabzon's ship slipped out of the small dock at the other end of the station, Dabzon said it had been built during the war by the commander to accommodate personal couriers, and sped away toward the edge of the system. Klaus looked at the screen and asked hopefully, "Why don't we hit their ship with something? We can't just run away without leaving them a parting gift." Dabzon jerked his head, and his eye flaps moved down and up rapidly. To the Ullerian, this was the equivalent of a shrug. Unlike many followers of the new path, Dabzon didn't feel it necessary to try to mimic human facial expressions to make better contact. "You think I wouldn't do it if I could?" he said. "But they've got a multi-role assault ship, and I've only got a few small guided missiles on board with weak warheads. It's just a reinforced courier sloop. I took it for speed and stealth. Unlike some people, I can't afford to race around the galaxy in full-fledged warships." "Neither can I," Klaus said. "But the situation calls for it sometimes. Our friends, on the other hand, don't seem to care. I think they flew into the system or someplace nearby in another ship that wasn't so conspicuous. Then, they took that flying tank out of mothballs and went after me. Why after you? It's not clear from my message exactly who is supposed to arrive at the station if they intercepted it on the relay." "Because it's not about the message," Dabzon said. "I've been bugged." "Don't worry," he said to Klaus. "I've already found the bug and checked the whole ship. I thought I'd meet you, and we'd find out who was interested in me so suddenly. But I didn't expect them to be so quick." "Okay," Klaus said. "To hell with them. But maybe they're the ones who brought me here, though." Dabzon waited silently, looking like a stone statue of a Ullerian veteran. All Ullerian veterans looked like stone statues of themselves. "Tell me this," Klaus said, looking Dabzon straight in the eye. "Do you know anything about shipments of Ullerian-made field-grade heavy weapons from the war into Federation territory?" Dabzon was silent for a moment, then blinked. "I don't know," he said, "but I think I'm going to have to find out soon, because I flew to meet you with a counter-question. Do you know anything about the free colonies being supplied with frozen Ullerian embryos to raise as slaves?" Klaus was so dumbfounded that he was speechless for a full minute. "I'll be damned," he said at last. "What the hell is going on in this damn galaxy?" "No idea," Dabzon said. "But I guess we're going to have to find out." Klaus closed his eyes. "And I thought I'd have a chance to grow old in peace after all these years," he said.
Part 6.
Even if you've looked directly into the muzzle of a gun many times, the sensations that overwhelm you will never fade. You can learn to keep them under control, but inside, you'll still have the same crazy cyclone of adrenaline and emotion that makes some people petrified and others do wild, reckless things. Delmain Backwater wasn't going to do either of those things. Instead, he slowly lowered his gun and said, "I don't think there's any need to get heated beforehand. You came here to talk, not for target practice, right?" The man who had just burst into his office and pointed a heavy army pulse pistol directly at his forehead exhaled slowly, holstered the weapon, and sank heavily into the chair across from Delmain. Backwater looked calmly at Kashida's deputy, Christo Gonchev. Christo was noticeably younger than Kashida, but had worked with him for over a decade. He'd started at the bottom, one of the young thugs Kashida had recruited into the police force after the rot-gut cleanup raids. The old concept, known since the legendary VDOC, worked this time. No one is better at catching criminals than a former criminal. However, the embittered teenager who once fell into the nets of Kishida has long been gone without a trace. In front of Backwater now sat a confident professional. Confident and very angry. Christo was furious, just like his boss in this very office not so long ago. "Let's not go in circles," Delmain said. "We went over all this with Kishida already. Whatever sins I may have committed in the distant past and running present, the chief agreed that turning the station into a battlefield of gang war was not in my interest." "Is that why you blew up the chief right at your own dock?" Christo couldn't help himself. Delmain sighed. "So, you decided to go in circles after all. Even if I was behind all this outrage, why would I want to set myself up like this? You will clearly comb the whole place with a fine-tooth comb. You won't miss a single molecule and will do it on a hot trail. Christo, you've known me for years. I may not be a saint, but I'm certainly not an idiot. Let's see what the forensics will say," Gonchev muttered. But it was evident that he had already mastered himself. "Thank God the chief survived. I contacted the medics a few minutes ago. They say his condition is serious but stable with a tendency to improve. His life is not threatened at the moment. I suppose you've already sent out your minions to sniff out what's going on, and now you're waiting for them to bring you some poor souls to your lair so you can beat a confession out of them?" Delmain didn't even smile. Christo always spoke in that caustic manner. Delmain didn't even smile. Christo always spoke in that caustic manner. "You're confusing me with someone else, Christo," he said. "It's your prerogative to get statements out of arrested people. I don't deny that I have connections and channels in the station that are unavailable to the police, but I am far from omnipotent. Besides, my best employees," at this word, Christo couldn't hold back a sardonic smirk, "including my son Train, have traveled outside the station for potentially important information. We can request any information from any station's or planet's police department," Gonchev said. "It would be faster and more reliable. For all the relative independence, we still formally belong to the same department. Provided the information is located wherever police stations exist," Delmain parried. "And my men went to places you guys don't even look at. Those weapons had to come from somewhere. I think you'll agree that it's unlikely that it could have been lying around for so many years in some stash here in our place." "You're right," Gonchev nodded reluctantly. "Besides, I haven't told you yet, but the experts have given me some preliminary conclusions from the explosion site. Apparently, the mine's fuse was also of Ullerian manufacture. It's too early to tell when it was made, but the expert suspects it was in the war's final months. When the Ullerians began to actively send sabotage groups into our rear," Delmain finished. "It all fits." Christo grimaced. "It fits, but it's unclear where or on whom. Who's behind all this chaos? Could it be the Ullerians themselves?" Delmain shook his head. "I've thought about that. No, it's highly unlikely. For one thing, why would they do that? I'd understand if they started messing around in the buffer zone, but the station's far from their sector. And, patriotism aside, the station isn't important enough to the Federation that messing with it, or even taking it over, would do much damage to the Federation." "Agreed." Gonchev tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "Plus one more thing. If the Ullerians had conducted the operation, there would have been dozens, if not hundreds, of times more corpses. Instead of hastily constructed amateur ambushes in dark alleys, they would have simply blown up one of the station's sectors, and that would have been the end of it." "That's right. Look, whatever you think you know about me being omnipotent on the station, it's far from it. and no one comes running to me with reports from Rot Gut or any other stinking hole about how much homemade dope they've pushed to each other and which of the next scumbag assholes got his stupid head blown off by the explosion of a poorly assembled smuggled pulse pistol. Because I simply do not give a shit. It's your people who are supposed to deal with that. Relax. Backwater looked calmly at Gonchev. I'm not accusing you of anything. It was the war that created this dump, and we'll have to clean it up together for years to come. I'm completely on your side in this mess. Afraid the feds are going to come here and shut you down? That too. And I also simply want to live here, in peace and quiet. But now we're forced to respond to a much bigger threat. Well, here's the thing. I may not know everything that goes on in the darkest corners of the station, but... Delmain paused. I know people we can ask. So ask them. Gonchev wanted to give him a scornful look, but curiosity won out. Wait, if you're telling me about it, I must be involved somehow, right? Why do you need a policeman to talk to another bandit? Come on, Christo. Delmain winked at him. You know what we're talking about. Information is the most important commodity to these people, and they won't just give it up. They have to be persuaded, and our arguments have to be very valuable. The policeman shrugged his shoulders. I'm afraid I can't do much on my salary. Don't you have a special fund for bribes and payoffs? Delmain shook his head. The man I'm talking about isn't interested in money. I meant something else. Gonchev looked at him incomprehensibly, but after a second, he went stone-faced again. No, I won't do it. But Kishida would, Delmain said. He was getting tired of the stubborn, uncooperative deputy whose chief was now lying in the intensive care pod. In fact, he'd done it more than once. Look, you probably have your own informants, with whom you pay not only in money but also by turning a blind eye to their dubious dealings, as long as they do not overstep certain boundaries. Am I right? Yes. Gonchev nodded reluctantly. But those boundaries are defined by me and are very clear and rigid. And what you are going to propose, I'm just sure that, in this case, the red line will run exactly along the border of hell. And I'm not going to give indulgences to the most vile scum in this giant rusty tin can. How quickly some people forget their origins, Backwater thought. Or maybe they don't. Maybe it was just an involuntary way of psychological defense, as Christo's desire to forget about his not-so-happy childhood, to erase it from his memory. It could very well be. But Delmain would certainly not psychoanalyze the zealous policeman now. Nobody's going to ask you for absolution for the rest of the time until the heat death of the universe, he said. The person I'm proposing to approach, well, I've known him for a long time. A very long time. He's not without his oddities, and dealing with him is not the most pleasant experience you can have, but he's not a fool. I think we can agree on some reasonable terms. Gonchev stared at Delmain for a while in silence, squinting his brown eyes, then finally sighed heavily. All right, he said, relaxing a little. I'll do it. On the condition that if this mysterious source of yours starts overreacting or gets greedy, we call the whole thing off and get out of there. The only thing I'm willing to guarantee up front is that I won't arrest him on the spot, and I'm guessing there are plenty of reasons to arrest him. Where does he even live, this super informant of yours? Delmain smiled. I have no idea, he said, looking straight into the policeman's surprised eyes. But I can, ask around in the hood. Almost all pre-war stations, and D-13 among them, were originally designed to be self-moving. Now, of course, it was hard to say who could even think of moving these huge clumsy monsters, but the fact remained that the D-13, that is, the Backwater Station, was designed to accommodate several super-powerful thrusters and power cores to feed those engines and anything else that might be needed to move this monster in space. The deliriousness of this concept eventually got into the heads of the engineers of the company that built the station. When the company's management realized how much costs they could cut by refusing to purchase incredibly expensive, powerful engines, the project was quickly reconsidered. Only 2 massive, barrel-shaped shells were left as the legacy of the wild, unknown genius. They were supposed to hold separate quark reactors to supply the engines with energy. In the wonderful, abundant pre-war times, stations like D-13 were built with the expectation of comfort and even some luxury, so it did not occur to anyone to turn these barrels into residential sectors. They were occasionally used as storage or repair hangars for small ships, but due to their poor location at the very furthest end of the station, they were mostly empty. The war had changed everything, and now both hulls had residents. They were not as dangerous as the inhabitants of Rotgut, but they were independent and extremely suspicious of all the visitors, whether from the station or from elsewhere in the galaxy. Delmain had to pull all sorts of strings to find out where the man he needed might be. Gonchev waited patiently in the next room. Delmain had asked him to step out so as not to give Christo a complete list of his contacts, many of whom were not eager to get into the deputy chief's notebooks. Eventually, his search was successful, and now they were flying on Delmain's skimmer. He had managed to explain to Christo that the first sight of a police skimmer would turn any local into a deaf mute, to one of the former power core hulls, to the small makeshift pier with an airlock in the center of the far bottom of the huge barrel. "I'll do the talking," Delmain warned, amid the hissing and clanking of the mooring automatics. "If anyone has a chance of getting this man to talk, it's me. Please don't interfere in our conversation before it's over, no matter how much you want to. You could absolutely ruin everything. And don't grab your gun no matter what happens. I'll handle it myself." Christo nodded grudgingly, involuntarily lowering his hand to his hip holster, but caught himself moving and immediately jerked his palm away. Delmain gave a quick chuckle and stepped toward the skimmer's inlet hatch, which had already docked with the dock's airlock. When the pressure indicator turned green, both the skimmer and external airlock doors slid open almost simultaneously. Delmain sighed heavily and closed his eyes. Behind him, Gonchev made a low whimpering noise, obviously struggling to keep his promise to sit quietly and not interfere. "What the hell do you do here with that stinking parody of a cop at your back?" a low, husky voice said. It was calm enough, considering the other circumstances. Delmain opened his eyes. For the second time in a day, he was staring into the gun's muzzle. "Good to see you too, Kenneth," he said. "Why don't you put the gun down, huh? It was a different way I'd imagined meeting my big brother, even if I hadn't seen him in years."
Part 7.
"It doesn't add up," Train said. Sitting in the chair with his hands cuffed behind the back wasn't very comfortable, but he tried to assume as relaxed a posture as possible. At least Quan's thugs had used power cuffs, which were relatively gentle on the wrists unless you started to twitch. Steel ones would have been a lot worse. "Kay, you have to realize that your version of the story doesn't work. If we'd really killed your men back home on Backwater and then went on this crazy raid on the temple, why on earth would we show up here in such small numbers, knowing that you'd survived to meet us?" Kay was sitting at the table across from Train, staring somewhere in the steel wall past him. With his impassive expression and almost complete immobility, he reminded Train of the statues and images of the ancient deity that adorned almost every corner of the celestial temple. It was his hands, however, that gave him away. The fingers of Kwan's right hand drummed on the metal surface of the table, while his left hand was absent-mindedly patting his breast pocket. From the moment Kwan's men had pushed Train, Kaylina, and Shank out of the shuttle and separated them into different rooms, Train had no idea what had happened to his friends. However, he wasn't too worried about their fate. Kwan wasn't the type prone to making hasty, drastic decisions, a Kwan family trait. They were always waiting to act until they got to the bottom of whatever was happening around them. Train wanted to get to the bottom of it as much as the master of the Celestial Temple. "I know it doesn't add up," Kwan finally said. "Although, at first, I thought your crazy veteran had finally gone completely off the rails." "Don't argue," he said, glaring at Train, though the latter was as quiet as before. "I know he hates me, or rather not me, but our whole station." Kwan waved his hand. "Everyone has their own demons. As long as people kept them in check, I didn't care too much. But now I realize that massacres aren't Klaus's style." Train grinned. "If it's any consolation, he told me himself that he'd rather put a couple of antimatter torpedoes into the station," he said. "He thought it would be more reliable." "Exactly. And he certainly wouldn't have started by eliminating my men at your place. And you three wouldn't have come here as if you were taking a walk." Kwan looked hard at Train. "But someone killed my men. Killed them on your station. D-13 doesn't belong to the Backwater family any more than the Celestial Temple belongs to the Kwans," Train pointed out. "The station is under Federation jurisdiction. We even pay taxes." Kwan waved his words away. "Don't play dumb, Train. Keep this smokescreen for somebody else. Everyone knows how it goes. You may not have sole control of the station like you did in the lawless days of yore, but that doesn't change much. Backwaters are backwaters." "Exactly," Train said stiffly. "That's why we're just as interested as you are in finding out what the hell's going on at the station. I was ambushed too, by the way. And Shank and Kaylina were in the hangar where your men were killed. Kaylina was wounded when she tried to pull one of them out of the crossfire." Kwan was silent for a while, then unzipped his breast pocket and tossed a small object onto the table in front of Train. "I'm not an idiot," he said in a strangely slightly changed voice, and Train suddenly realized what a storm of emotion was simmering beneath the man's outward impenetrability. "But the facts tell a different story. How do you explain this?" Train looked at him. "The hands," he said calmly. Kwan stared straight into his eyes. "Oh, come on, Kay," Train said. "What are you afraid of? I'm not going to jump on you and try to strangle or bite you to death." Kwan thought for a few seconds, then nodded faintly. "All right," he said curtly, turned in his chair, and pressed the button of the mini remote control on the small shelf by the door. "But be warned, the doors are locked, and my guards don't care if you take me hostage. You'll get shot." Train didn't even bother to react to that warning. As soon as he felt the power cuffs release his wrists, he leaned forward and picked up what Kwan had tossed on the table a few seconds ago. It was a chip card, the usual means of payment on all inhabited worlds. The first thing that caught Train's eye was that it had been issued by the Second Federal Bank branch at Backwater Station. There was nothing particularly incriminating about that, though. Train was sure that even Kwan himself had the card issued by that bank. But the name on the card, Chug Stanger. Chug was one of Delmain's closest aides and the fourth most senior member of the Ring. But he was supposed to be on the other side of the Federation right now, negotiating with an independent company on the Blue Flash for supplies. Well, very important supplies that the Ring had high hopes for. How could his card be here, on the Celestial Temple? Train raised his eyes to Kay. "Just the card?" he asked. Kwan grinned. "Wasn't that enough for you?" No, we didn't find Chug himself, dead or alive. But I would very much like to know how his card ended up in the pile of bodies of my men. Train shook his head slowly. Kay, I swear I have no idea. Chug should be hundreds of light years away from here right now. Quan stared at him silently. Train couldn't read anything on this stone face. He understood that his life, as well as the lives of Kylena and Shank, depended on the thoughts and feelings of this short man, who, in fact, was only a little older than Train himself. I believe you, Quan said finally, if only because, apart from this card, we found nothing to link the attack to you. It was obviously planted. Wait. He raised his hand, though Train wasn't really going to say anything. Even if it was, it wouldn't make much difference. If someone went to great expense and terrible risk just to frame the backwaters, it's all the more dangerous for us. Do you understand? I don't know what you've gotten into, but these side effects... After all, people died. Good people. What am I going to tell their friends and loved ones? A lot of them weren't even related to my family. I knew Chung, Train said grimly. He didn't deserve this. Quan grimaced like from physical pain. None of them deserved it, and the problem of retribution is now on my shoulders. Can you answer one question? Train looked at Quan. I have some information that might help, but I must be sure first. I'm listening. Quan shrugged. But I can't promise an answer. Have you determined what weapons were used in the attack? Quan looked at him incomprehensively. Pulse rifles and pistols. You saw it yourself. What did you expect? Muskets and halberds? Train shook his head impatiently. I'm not talking about the model. I'm talking about where these weapons were made. You can't tell much from the hits. But did you find anything? I don't know. Empty energy cells or something? Quan paused for a second, then pressed a button on his communicator and quickly spoke a phrase in a language Train didn't recognize. He waited a while, then listened to the answer and reverted off the communicator. What do you know? He said quickly. If you knew something about the attackers, why did you keep silent? Why didn't you say anything from the beginning? Ullerian army hardware? Train asked instead of answering. Quan nodded gravely. The control room was clean, but my men found several empty energy cells and a melted magnetic shutter in the repair shops. They were inspected by a man of mine named Wong. He'd been here as far back as... well, as far back as my grandfather's time. Train nodded. In grandfather's time meant during the Ullerian occupation. Good thing Klaus isn't here, he thought. Anyway, he recognized the whole thing. Said it was from old Army Ullerian models. They haven't been manufactured since practically the end of the war. He looked at Train. Your turn. The attack on our station, the one that killed your men and wounded Kylena, was also done with old Ullerian weapons. Plasma turrets. Also, someone ambushed Klaus and me in the same way. We were luckier. Quan was silent for so long that Train was about to make his presence known, but then Kay spoke. We value our independence, but it's a very fragile thing. After my grandfather died and the Ullerians left, my father negotiated with the then Federation Fleet Command to maintain our status as an independent station. The Navy had enough problems elsewhere, and the Temple was too small a station to make sense to keep a garrison on it. You, he cast a quick glance at Train. Had it different, I know. A former major trading and transportation hub after all. I guess the feds had big plans for you, and they just didn't care about us. We ended up almost evenly matched, although you've got Kishida, and we're on our own. Kishida was blown up, Train said. With a Ullerian charge too, right in our dock, our family dock. He survived but won't be back to business for a while. Quan spoke a few unintelligible words in a low voice, but their intonation required no translation. It was a swearing. "Someone is rocking the boat as hard as they can," he said. "That someone was counting on our families going at each other and having a bloodbath after the attack at the stations. Luckily, we've avoided that. For now. But I'm not a dictator, no matter how it looks from the outside. If I don't find those responsible, the relatives of the victims will ask me differently, and they can take matters into their own hands. Besides, even if we don't start a war but the attacks continue, the feds will ignore the special status of the Celestial Temple and your freedom, and they'll do a brutal purge as they see fit." "I don't know anyone who would benefit from that," Train admitted. "Not even the feds themselves. Besides, that kind of intrigue isn't their style." Kay nodded, but Train could see that he had his doubts. Finally, Quan seemed to make up his mind. "We have to work together," he said. "We have to find the source of the threat, or we're all finished. Agreed?" "Yes. One condition," Quan said. "Keep Klaus away from my men. Otherwise, it will end up really messy." "Of course." Train shrugged. "He's off somewhere outside the Federation now anyway, picking up some of his old contacts, trying to find out where heavy wartime Ullerian weaponry might have gotten to the station from. There aren't many places like that unless you count the core Ullerian planets, which we ruled out immediately. Yes, it's not in their nature to do dirty stuff under the radar, but there's something else." Quan rose tiredly and, opening the door, invited Train out with a nod. "There's another place where you can get such weapons." "Holy shit," Shank muttered, looking around dazedly. "There's enough stuff here to arm a whole bloody army. In fact, 2 armies, 4 fully deployed and manned Ullerian assault brigades," Quan said. "But with relatively little ammunition. Ammunition was supposed to be supplied separately." Racks of weapons towered high and deep into the dark depths of the giant hangar. Pulse rifles, hypervelocity rocket launchers, plasma guns, on turrets and handheld, all sorts of kinetic weapons, Ullerian assault armor, helmets. It was really everything you needed to arm a full-fledged military unit. "That was the price we agreed to with the Ullerians," Quan said. "We host the warehouses and they bypass us. They were still hoping to come back then. Grandfather bet that they wouldn't, and his bet won." "And you've been sitting on all this since the war?" Train shook his head incredulously. "That's a real bombshell. The feds—" "They don't know shit about it," Quan said stiffly. "They don't have to know. Do you have any idea what would happen not only to my people, but to the population of the entire station if it became known that the largest existing Ullerian arsenal in the galaxy is based here? And if someone were to leak it?" Quan sighed. "Only a handful of people, no more than a dozen at most, know what is hidden deep inside the station. Family members and a couple veterans from the war. All of them are well aware of what will happen if someone leaks information. That includes you, by the way. I hope you realize that if anything happens, Backwater Station will be in the crosshairs too." Train and Shank looked at each other. "Sure," Shank said. "Sure thing, bro. But still, it's just freaking mind-boggling. All these years." Quan sighed again. "I'm going to have to do the very unpleasant task of turning everyone who knows about the arsenal inside out. But I don't think the weapons came from here. I'm the only one who knows the security codes, and the only way to disable it is to scan my neural print. Any break-in would end in alarm and the intruder's death. Or rather, his death first, and then the alarm. The system was installed by Ullerian intelligence." Train suddenly felt very uncomfortable in the huge, dusty hall, crammed with the most sophisticated instruments of mass murder. Ullerian security systems were renowned for their lethality and selectivity. He'd never believed the Ullerians knew how to tune them to human neural processes, but after Quan's words, his confidence was shaken. Was there any attempts? Quan smiled, but there was no warmth in this smile. A few, very few. Train decided not to investigate further. They'd left Kylena on the ship, at Quan's request, and because they didn't want to leave the ship unattended. A treaty was great, but they better ensure Quan's men hadn't bugged it all over. Better be safe than sorry, as they say. "Can I tell my father?" Train asked as they exited the arsenal, which the station's schematics had labeled as a radioactive waste repository. "I think he should know too." Quan shook his head. "No." "Why not? Kay, you can't go rogue in a case like this." The look in Quan's black eyes pierced through Train. "Because I'll tell him myself." Train stared at him. "I'm coming with you," Quan said. "It all started at Backwater Station, and that's where it ends." Quan shook his head. "No." "Why not?" "Kay, you can't go rogue in a case like this." The look in Quan's black eyes pierced through Train. "Because I'll tell him myself." Train stared at him dumbfounded. "I'm coming with you," Quan said. "It all started at Backwater Station, and that's where it ends."
Part 8.
"You know, I've almost forgotten what it's like to have no one staring at you." Dabzan Ed Chinbar gestured around the busy street of Tomclest, the city that had grown up around the planet's main spaceport. Indeed, all sorts of intelligent beings who were bustling along the neat hexagonal tiles of the sidewalk were not paying the slightest attention to him and Klaus. There were representatives of all 17 known intelligent races in the galaxy, including even those still far from reaching the interstellar expanse on their own. At one of the intersections, Klaus even spotted the massive six-armed figure of an Osmolian in a ritual garb of skins. This species had been recognized as fully intelligent just before the outbreak of war. He was deftly handling a large street fryer with several skewers, grilling some morsels, the origin of which Klaus did not even want to think about. While working on the fryer, Osmolian was carefully watching the lines running across the screen of a small network tablet. After a closer look, Klaus was amazed to recognize a real-time summary of the local stock exchange in those lines. If there was any place in the inhabited sector of the galaxy where a human and a Ullerian could walk around together without causing a storm of emotion or even a side glance, it was Tlop, a trading planet of the Kshadra race. A civilization that had barely crossed the threshold of interstellar flight and had mastered only 3 star systems. The Kshadra had managed to emerge from the terrible war between the Earth Federation and the Ullerian conglomerate, virtually unscathed. The main role, of course, was played by the fact that their planets were located at the very edge of the space explored by both major civilizations. For the Kshadra, the war that had swept across many Federation and conglomerate worlds remained distant, unimportant, and incomprehensible, especially considering that both warring civilizations were alien to the Kshadra biologically and in all other respects, which didn't stop Kshadra from trying to make the best of the situation. "I can't say I'm all that familiar with this feeling," Klaus said. "The last time I was on a conglomerate planet was 30 years ago, and I certainly wasn't greeted with flowers and songs." "You won't be greeted with flowers and songs now either," Dobson said. "We don't have an established tradition of flowers and singing." Klaus shook his head. "Sometimes I think that's why the war started. You guys are such a bore. Art is a pretty pointless waste of resources," Dobson said. "But we do have it in some forms." "Yeah, sure. a few thousand sharpening schemes for edged weapons, and an infinite number of deadly martial arts. Okay, that's your problem. As far as how this place feels, I agree with you. Everybody here seems to don't care about shit. After the backwater, it even gives me creeps. I'm constantly thinking about what they can be up to. We didn't come here to relax. Klaus looked longingly at the huge holographic advertisement for the luxury casino. Easy for you to say. You Ullerians probably don't even know what it is to relax. Why haven't I come here before? Dobzon looked at him with his inhuman eyes. Why indeed? It seemed to me that it would make sense for you, for backwaters in the ring, to do business through the Kshadra. They're outside the Federation's jurisdiction, and your activities don't fit well with that jurisdiction. Klaus sighed. It's too far away. There's practically the entire Federation between us and the Kshadra worlds. If you're building supply chains from here, the chances of a shipment being intercepted by customs or some random patrol somewhere are too high. It's safer to work with suppliers inside the Federation, even though the purchase prices here at Kshadra may be 2 to 3 times lower. Besides, the Kshadra are trying not to irritate the Federation unnecessarily, so they will start leaning on our potential suppliers themselves. And what is it you're selling that's so interesting? The human would have looked at Klaus with a sly squint, but Dobzon's gaze was the same as always, cold and expressionless. Klaus smirked and winked at Dobzon. Things that are best not known to anyone, but those who are supposed to know. One couldn't let slip what one didn't know. So, who and where are we looking for here? Dobzon pointed to a large building overlooking the northern part of the city. Like most of Kshadra's buildings, it looked like an unkempt pile of giant honeycombs, gleaming with thousands of hexagonal mirrored windows. That's the place. What's in there? The local information desk? In a way, yes. It's the exchange house. Klaus looked back at the Osmolian with his clipboard. What the hell do we need a stock exchange for? Are you going to buy a couple of lots of pangalactic base metals or New Hope shipyard bonds? You know you can do it on the net, do you? Dobzon shook his head faintly. Those brokers sitting there don't trade ordinary stocks and assets. That's why they don't transact over the net. Their goods are too easy to steal there. They deal in information. Never before had Klaus been subjected to such an unusual check. The information exchange's security had put him and Dobzon through as many as 3 different scanners, resulting in Klaus giving up, temporarily of course, several items, personal comms, expected, and a couple of other devices. The most surprising thing was that Klaus was offered to sell his small ray gun right there at the security checkpost. He'd left his favorite big pulse gun on the ship. Although Dobzon had assured him that Tlap's trade cities practiced very liberal personal weapon laws, Klaus had quickly checked out a few of the broadcasts on the local network. Finding that no one on the streets was showing off the heavy pieces, he decided not to draw attention to himself. When he honestly laid his beamer out on the pallet at the checkpoint, the weapon sparked a lively discussion among the guards. Klaus was a little worried, but it turned out that one of the guards was a heavy collector. Since the gun was handmade, it had been made especially for Klaus by a craftsman back home at Backwater Station. The guard was naturally interested. Finally, they agreed that Klaus would consider selling the gun, and in the meantime, it would be kept in a special private safe box for visitors to the exchange. "It's tight here," Klaus said. "The last time I went through such a thorough search was back in the service, at the sector headquarters. Dobzon, I can't believe they even took samples for protein checks. I thought the bio-drones were a special branch bogey. I've never heard of those since the war. I thought the bio-drones were a special branch bogey. I've never heard of those since the war. The conglomerate bio-drones were a sure bogey. We didn't do that. But the Federation needed an excuse to occupy the Yellow Sector planets, which the conglomerate didn't really control. So disinformation was thrown in that artificial clones were being manufactured there to be inserted behind Federation lines. Klaus shook his head. "It's tight here," Klaus said. "The last time I went through such a thorough search was back in the service, at the sector headquarters. Dabzan, I can't believe they even took samples for protein checks. I thought the bio-drones were a special branch bogey. I've never heard of those since the war. I was on the other side of the galaxy at the time, mostly either on a raid or under arrest." He smirked. "My commanders were afraid to let me near civilians, so I've only heard some scraps and pieces." "I'd be afraid too," Dabzan said. "The station must be celebrating your absence right now. As for distinguishing between true data and misinformation, they're probably better at it here than anywhere else in the galaxy. But I, too, heard a thing or two. Have you ever heard of the Trigon Tech Corporation?" "Sure," Klaus answered. They exited the inspection hall and walked to the elevator, escorted by 2 guards. Major armaments and other equipment suppliers to the Federation space fleet and army. In fact, they were one of the companies that hit it large on military contracts. After the war, they'd relocated to the independent colonies and somehow faded into the shadows. Disappeared from the news reports anyway. He shrugged. "I guess they're still working for the military but keeping it low profile." He glanced at the guards behind him, but their faces reflected no more emotion than the faces of 10,000-year-old Tofane mummies. Dabzan intercepted his gaze. "Relax. We're not discussing anything top secret," he said. "These are just rumors that have been floating around for years." The elevator doors opened with a quiet hiss, and they stepped inside. To Klaus's surprise, the guards didn't follow them. "What the—" "They were here to ensure we didn't skip away before entering the elevator," Dabzan said. "Once in there, we'll be secured from their point of view. The elevator is sealed except for the ventilation, and it's controlled from the outside." Indeed, there was no control panel in the elevator. Klaus felt uncomfortable, like a lab rat in a locked box. "So, what were those rumors about Trigon Tech?" he asked, trying not to think about what would happen to them if the elevator got stuck. It was stupid for a man who'd lived most of his life on spaceships and stations to feel claustrophobic, but ancient fears crawled out from some deep corner of his mind and started to chew on him. "Rumor has it they were developing artificial intelligence," Dabzan said, "and its carriers, bio-drones. Some said they had succeeded, but then something happened. Some kind of internal leak, act of espionage, or sabotage. Trigon's been out of sight ever since, and the others—" Dabzan looked up at the ceiling of the elevator. "And all the others are trying to play it safe now." Klaus looked at the Ullerian carefully. "How do you know about this? It's not like the independent weapon-making corporations or the Federation Fleet's purchasing department distributes monthly newsletters in Ullerian. I was informed of it by the person we're about to meet." Dabzan pointed to the ceiling of the elevator. "And you trust him?" "More than I trust you." "Do you?" Klaus squinted. "So who is he? Your former special ops teammate? I'm not sure I want to depend on another Ullerian. I have my hands full with you already." Dabzan's narrow amber eyes stared at Klaus from beneath his heavy, horny brow, as if from the embrasures of an individual Ullerian bunker. "You're almost right," he said. "In a way. I've known him for nearly 40 years, only he's not Ullerian. He's human." "That's some good news," Klaus said. "Wait, what do you mean 40 years? That's before—" At that moment, the elevator stopped, and the doors slid open. Dabzan, followed by a still surprised Klaus, stepped inside a large room with huge panoramic windows. In fact, there weren't even windows, but a glazed wall behind which a beautiful view of the spaceport stretched. While they were being processed at the checkpoint, night had fallen outside, and now numerous ships and spaceport structures were shimmering spectacularly with countless lights against the black, starry sky. Looking at all this splendor, a man stood at the far end of the room with his back to the new arrivals. The man turned and stepped toward them as Dabzan and Klaus took a few more silent steps. Their feet were buried in the fluffy, soft carpet, which completely masked all sound. "Hello, Dabzan," he said, and then Klaus got a good look at his face. "You bastard," he yelled and lunged at the man. "You know, people in my line of work are used to some weird welcomes," said the office owner, "but this was probably the most original greeting I've ever received from a visitor." Klaus wanted to get up, but as soon as he pulled his head away from the armrest of the sofa, a flash of pain pierced his skull, and he collapsed back with a groan. "Hold still," Dabzan said. "I've injected you with painkillers, but they'll start to work in a couple minutes. If you keep acting funny, I'll load you up with tranks, but I'd rather not. I need that little something you have for a brain to keep ticking." Klaus looked at the man standing a few feet away. Klaus's heart clenched again at the sight of the disfigured face, spewing more rage and hatred into his bloodstream. But this time, he managed his emotions. "I'll make do," he muttered, "provided you explain to me what the hell we're doing in the same room with that scum." The man reached up and touched the scars on the left side of his face. Something told Klaus it was an old habit, an automatic, unconscious gesture. I might as well wonder what a Federation veteran is doing in the company of a Ullerian Special Forces officer. Klaus jerked, but this time he was held back by Dabzan's hand on his chest. "The war ended 30 years ago, Klaus," the Ullerian said. "We all have our pasts. And someone's past is that of a traitor." The man raised his hand to his face again, but stopped halfway. "You can only receive a mark of allegiance by asking for it voluntarily, but the motives for asking for it vary. However, I suspect you did not come here to ask about my dubious past. And, since Dabzan took the risk of bringing you along despite all things concerned, I'm guessing it's serious. Klaus, do you remember where we first met?" Dabzan asked. "If I'm not mistaken, it was the concentration camp at Backwater Station. I pulled you out of a shipment destined for the butchery, and you tried to kill me with a sharpened toothbrush in gratitude." Klaus drew in a breath, but didn't say anything. The medicine was starting to take effect, and the pain was fading, and with it, some of the anger. Maybe the bastard really did sedate me, he thought. The hell with it, though. The man with the Ullerian mark of allegiance sat down at the table. "You can call me Val. So what brings you two here?" 10 minutes later, after Klaus and Dabzan had described their recent adventures, Val thought for a few minutes, then leaned back in his chair and looked straight into Klaus's eyes. Klaus was by now sitting straight on the couch. The rage was almost gone, but he knew that somewhere in the bottom of his heart, there was still some fury smoldering. Val shook his head. "I don't like this case, and I'm not getting into it." Klaus snorted contemptuously. What else to expect from a traitor and a coward? Val glanced at him. No grunge or anger, just curiosity. "Don't waste your energy. It won't work. Cowardice doesn't go well for people like me, but that doesn't matter. What's important is that you're not the first to contact me about the Backwater Station." Klaus pitched forward. "Who?" Val smiled. The scars made the smile look rather creepy. See? Now you could talk without accusing me. The answer is simple. I don't know. All pre-orders come to me anonymously through our separate mailbox, and I didn't take the order, so there was no further communication with the customer. Why didn't you take it? Dabzan asked. Val stopped smiling. I don't take hit jobs. The preliminary letter was rather vague, but the main thing was clear. It was necessary to eliminate a few people at Backwater Station. I'm not an assassin. I'm a courier. A courier? Klaus laughed. Val shrugged. I deliver messages and investigate details in the most complicated cases. Say, when the addressee has long since disappeared from sight, or even when he doesn't want to be found. And I always follow the job through. That's why I get paid enough to afford this modest office. But I never take hot orders. That order was hot as hell. What about the contraband of Ullerian embryos? Dabzan asked. Val sighed. That's what worries me the most. I got this offer too. I was asked to find out if the authorities on some independent planets were willing to buy the goods. I'm sorry, Dabzan. That's how it was put out in the assignment. I said no, of course, and I think all the couriers I know said no. This stuff's hotter than helium at the center of a star, but someone with more greed than brain might have said yes. I can't believe a scum-sucking mercenary like you can brag about a piece of shit he had for conscience, Klaus said. Val looked at him with interest. Look who's talking, he said calmly. Of all people, the ring member must be the last to talk about conscience, especially after Delmain's expanded his product line. What would you know about that? Scraps and bits, enough to have no illusions about the Backwater family and their friends, but I'm pretty sure that compared to what my rejected anonymous client is up to, you guys would seem like toddlers. Wait, are you hinting that this is the same client? Val shook his head. I'm not hinting. I'm saying it straight out. Of course, the customer's identity is impossible to establish. I'm not even sure it's the same person, but I was able to trace the transmitter from which both hypergrams were sent to the courier's closed mailbox. Celestial Temple? Klaus blurted out. The Changat system? Or some Ullerian world? Dabzan asked. Val shook his head. Worse, or more interesting. Depends on how you look at it. He looked straight into Klaus's eyes. Both orders came from an unregistered transmitter at Backwater Station. Before Klaus could find an answer, the huge panoramic window suddenly shattered with countless microshards, and several armed men in dark clothes poured into the room with a gust of calm wind. All Klaus could do, still reeling from the crushing knockout from Val and slightly stunted from the horse dose of painkillers, was jump behind the couch and huddle into the fluffy carpet. Questionable cover, even from ancient firearms, let alone pulse guns or ray guns. But at least there was a chance he wouldn't get hit with the first shot. So much for guards and all the checks, he thought, while the long pile of the carpet fluttered into his nostrils, tickling him and causing the urge to sneeze. No one shot at him, though. There were shots, of course, and lots of them. A full rapid-fire gunfight, but none hit the couch or Klaus. Such a waste, Dabzan's voice came out. You should have left someone alive. Klaus stood up and looked around. The only thing that comforted him was that Dabzan had apparently not taken part in the fight either. The Ullerian was standing in the far corner of the room, hiding behind a large rack of antique books. The rack was several meters away, but Klaus wasn't surprised. Ullerians could move very fast if necessary, much faster than humans. Well, I'm sorry, Val said, tucking the pulse pistol away in his desk drawer. My reflexes are set on keeping me alive, not taking prisoners. 5 bodies lay where the gunshots had caught them. Dabzan approached one of them and picked up the plasma assault rifle. As you'd expect, he said to Klaus. An old army model, but the rifle is new, fresh from the warehouse. He looked around. Same with others. Val, meanwhile, looked out the window in the glittering lights of the spaceport and looked up. They somehow jammed the external surveillance systems and came down from above, he said. The window was blown out with targeted microbursts. It's regular crystallite with no reinforcement. We're worried about thieves and spies here, not clumsy stormtroopers. Why clumsy? Klaus asked. Though on second thought, I would probably agree. 5 on 3, and 2 of us were even unarmed. That's some clumsy outcome. You're a good shot, by the way, he added, grudgingly. I had good teachers. Val bent down and removed a tactical helmet from one of the corpses. Klaus noted how deftly, in one motion, he snapped the fasteners off. I don't know him, and he doesn't look like a professional. Does any of you have ever seen the guy? Dobzon dropped his gaze and gave a short, no. Klaus finally walked around the couch and looked into the dead man's face. Holy shit, he said with feeling. Death doesn't add to anyone's attractiveness, but in this case, not much had changed for the dead man. Alshin, the small-time crook who lured Klaus and Train into ambush against the Ullerian turret, was a very ugly man when he was alive. An old acquaintance of yours? Val asked, watching Klaus closely. Klaus shook his head. Worse. A source of information. He quickly ripped the helmets off the rest of the dead. He recognized only one of them, from the same gang as Alshin, but he had no doubt that the others were from Backwater Station too. I was sure he'd been taken out long ago, back home. Strange, unprofessional. Looks like all roads lead to Backwater, Dobson said. The communicator on Val's desk beeped. Val gave it a quick glance. Our incomparable security service has finally woken up, he said. This place will be full of people in a minute. You seem to know the drill, but just in case, I'll remind you. You don't know anything. You have no idea who these people are, and you came here to see if I could find your mutual grandmother's inheritance. He was quiet for a few seconds. And one more thing. Now you can count me in for this case. I'll see what I can do for you. You need money for repairs? Klaus said, pointing to the gaping hole where the wall had been. Val grinned. No, insurance will cover that. But I don't like it when people break in without knocking. The elevator doors swung open, and the room immediately filled with men in full assault armor.